There is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, where the women wear long skirts and wigs, even in July, where the men walk to synagogue in fur hats that cost more than most people's monthly rent, where the street signs are in Yiddish, where the stores close on Friday afternoon and do not reopen until Saturday night, where the internet is forbidden, where television does not exist, where smartphones are banned, and where children grow up speaking a language that died as a daily tongue for most of the world before their grandparents were born. This neighborhood is not in medieval Poland. It is not a museum exhibit or a heritage village. It is Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in the 21st century, 15 minutes by subway from Manhattan, the most modern and connected city on earth. And the people who live there are the Hasidim. They have been called the most closed community in the modern world. They have been called a state within a state. They have been called a mystery. And they are all of those things, but they are also something that nobody who drives through Williamsburg on the way to a rooftop bar or a artisan coffee shop ever stops to think about. They are, in the most literal and measurable sense, one of the most economically powerful communities in the entire city of New York. The majority of real estate in Borough Park belongs to them. Vast swaths of Crown Heights, enormous portions of Williamsburg, entire blocks of Flatbush. They have built a financial empire in the heart of the world's most expensive real estate market, while living by rules that the outside world cannot begin to understand, speaking a language the outside world cannot follow, and maintaining a level of communal discipline that the outside world has not seen since the Middle Ages. How did they do it? Who are they really? And what do they believe that makes them so different from every other community on Earth? Welcome to Sacred Mysteries, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand the Hasidim of Brooklyn, you have to go back to a forest in 18th century Ukraine. Not because history is just background, but because for the Hasidim, the 18th century is not background, it is the present. It is the living reality they are actively preserving, street by street, block by block, building by building, in the middle of one of the most relentlessly modern cities on Earth. The year is approximately 1700. Eastern Europe is, for the Jews who live there, a world of almost unimaginable difficulty. The Cossack massacres of 1648 and 1649, known in Jewish memory as the Chmielnicki pogroms, had killed somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 Jews across Ukraine and Poland. Entire communities had been wiped out. The religious and scholarly infrastructure that had taken centuries to build, the great yeshivas, the rabbinical courts, the networks of Jewish learning, had been shattered. The survivors were traumatized, impoverished, and living under the constant threat of further violence. Jewish religious life had, in the wake of this catastrophe, become increasingly dominated by an approach to Judaism that emphasized learning above almost everything else. The great rabbinic scholars, the Torah scholars, the Talmudic experts, the men who spent their entire lives in study, were the unquestioned elite of Jewish society. If you could not study, if you were a poor farmer or a laborer who had never mastered the vast complexities of Talmudic law, you were, in the religious hierarchy of the time, essentially a second-class Jew. You could observe the commandments, you could pray, but the deepest connection to God, the real Judaism, as it was implicitly understood, was reserved for those with the education and the leisure to pursue it. Into this world, sometime around 1700, was born a child named Israel ben Eliezer in a small village in what is now Western Ukraine. He would grow up to be known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, and he would change Judaism more profoundly than almost anyone since Moses. The story of the Baal Shem Tov is partly history and partly legend, and the Hasidim themselves make no sharp distinction between the two because for them both are equally true. What the historical record suggests is that he was a man of unusual spiritual gifts who worked as a clay digger and a teacher's assistant before emerging in his 30s as a healer and a spiritual guide of extraordinary power. What the tradition says is that he was a hidden tzaddik, a righteous man whose true spiritual stature was concealed from the world until God's appointed moment. He performed miracles. He healed the sick. He communed with divine sparks hidden in the material world. He ascended to the heavenly realms in states of mystical ecstasy and brought back teachings that could not have come from any human source. Whether you believe the miracles or not, what is historically undeniable is the revolution he started. The Baal Shem Tov taught that God was present everywhere, not just in the synagogue, not just in the pages of the Talmud, but in every blade of grass, every cup of water, every moment of ordinary human experience. He taught that the simple Jew, the farmer, the laborer, the man who had never mastered a page of Talmud, could connect to God as deeply and as authentically as the greatest scholar. Not through intellectual mastery, but through prayer, through joy, through intention, through the state of consciousness the Hasidim called deveket, cleaving to God, being present to the divine in every moment of existence. This was radical. This was, to the established rabbinic elite, genuinely dangerous, because it implied that the scholar's monopoly on spiritual authority was not ordained by God. It was a human construction. And a poor farmer in ecstatic prayer might be closer to God than a great rabbi poring over his books in cold rationality. The movement the Baal Shem Tov started spread with extraordinary speed across Eastern Europe. Within a generation of his death in 1760, Hasidism had hundreds of thousands of followers. Within 2 generations, it had millions. It transformed Jewish life across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Romania. It produced an entirely new kind of religious leader, the Rebbe, or tzaddik, a figure who was not primarily a scholar or a judge, but a spiritual master, a channel of divine blessing, a living connection between the earthly and the heavenly. The Rebbe was not elected. He was not appointed by any institutional process. His authority came from his spiritual stature and in the dynasties that formed around the great Rebbes from his lineage. The son of a great Rebbe could inherit his father's spiritual mantle, his father's community, his father's connection to the divine. This created the dynasties that still exist today: Satmar, Chabad Lubavitch, Belz, Bobov, Gur, Skver, each named for the Eastern European town where the founding Rebbe had his court, each preserving with almost obsessive fidelity the customs, the dress, the melodies, the particular spiritual flavor of that original community. And each one in the 20th century faced the same catastrophe, the Holocaust. The destruction of European Jewry was, for the Hasidic world, an annihilation without parallel. The shtetls of Poland and Ukraine, the world the Baal Shem Tov had created, were erased. Entire dynasties were wiped out. The Satmar Rebbe, Joel Teitelbaum, escaped from a Nazi deportation train through an extraordinary series of events involving a ransom payment organized by a Zionist rescue committee, a rescue he would spend the rest of his long life refusing to acknowledge with gratitude because his theology held Zionism to be a heresy. The Lubavitcher Rebbe of that generation, Menachem Mendel Schneerson's predecessor, managed to leave Europe before the war. Thousands of Hasidic Jews who survived the camps and the hiding in the forests arrived in New York in the late 1940s with nothing except their faith, their customs, their Yiddish language, and an absolutely iron determination to rebuild everything that had been destroyed. They chose Brooklyn. Specifically, they chose Williamsburg and Borough Park and Crown Heights neighborhoods that in the late 1940s were working-class Jewish areas with affordable housing and existing synagogue infrastructure. And what they did there over the next 70 years is one of the most remarkable stories of communal reconstruction in modern history. The first thing to understand about the Hasidic communities of Brooklyn is that they are not one community, they are many. And the differences between them, invisible to the outside eye, are to the Hasidim themselves as significant as the differences between nations. Satmar, based primarily in Williamsburg and Borough Park, is the largest Hasidic sect in the world. Its founder, Joel Teitelbaum, was one of the most formidable and controversial religious figures of the 20th century, a man of extraordinary Talmudic brilliance, fierce personal courage, and theological positions so uncompromising that they put him at odds with virtually every other major Jewish movement of his time. Teitelbaum believed that the establishment of the State of Israel before the coming of the Messiah was a catastrophic sin, a human usurpation of a divine prerogative that would bring suffering upon the Jewish people. He believed that Zionism was heresy. He believed that the Holocaust was in part divine punishment for Jewish assimilation and for the sin of Zionism. These are positions that most of the Jewish world finds repugnant, but within Satmar, they are binding religious law. Satmar Hasidim do not vote in Israeli elections. Many do not recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli state. Some of the most vocal anti-Zionist protesters at demonstrations against Israeli policy in American cities are Satmar Hasidim, a fact that confuses outside observers who cannot reconcile ultra-Orthodox Jews with anti-Israel activism, but which makes perfect internal theological sense. Chabad Lubavitch is almost the mirror opposite of Satmar in its relationship to the outside world. Where Satmar turns inward, Chabad reaches out. The last Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who led the movement from 1951 until his death in 1994, and whom many of his followers believed to be the Messiah, built Chabad into the most geographically widespread Jewish organization in the world. There are Chabad houses in over 100 countries. Chabad rabbis operate in university campuses, in airports, in remote villages in India and the highlands of Nepal. They use the internet. They have a massive global media operation. They embrace technology as a tool for spreading Jewish practice. And yet, in Crown Heights, their Brooklyn headquarters, they live by the same strict codes, the same Yiddish language, the same separation from secular culture as any other Hasidic community. It is a paradox that defines Chabad, a movement that engages the modern world in order to preserve a way of life that refuses it. Now we come to the question that the outside world always asks about the Hasidim of Brooklyn. The question of money, the question of real estate, the question of how a community of people who arrived in New York with almost nothing in the late 1940s came to own a significant portion of one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on earth. The answer is neither mysterious nor conspiratorial. It is a story of communal discipline, long-term thinking, and a set of social structures that the individualistic outside world is simply not built to replicate. The key is the eruv. An eruv is a ritual enclosure in practice, a nearly invisible wire strung between poles that, according to Jewish law, transforms a public space into a private domain and allows observant Jews to carry objects and push strollers on the Sabbath when carrying in a public space is otherwise forbidden. The eruv defines the boundaries of the community. It says, this is our space, we live here, we will stay here. Because Orthodox and Hasidic Jews must be able to walk to synagogue on the Sabbath, they cannot live far from their shul. Because they need kosher butchers, kosher bakeries, Jewish schools, Jewish ritual baths, they need a critical mass of their community within walking distance. This creates an extraordinary economic dynamic. Hasidic communities do not spread out, they concentrate. And when a community of tens of thousands of people with a birth rate 2 to 3 times the American average and an almost zero rate of members leaving for other neighborhoods concentrates in a specific geographic area, it creates enormous sustained demand for housing in that area. Prices go up. Existing residents who do not share the community's religious imperative to live in a specific location sell and move elsewhere. The community expands block by block in a process that is entirely market driven and entirely rational from the perspective of each individual actor, but that produces over decades a transformation of entire neighborhoods. The Hasidic community's real estate holdings in Brooklyn are not the product of a secret plan or a coordinated conspiracy. They are the product of demographics, religious law, communal solidarity, and time. A community that does not assimilate, does not intermarry, does not move to the suburbs, does not shrink, and does not stop having children at extraordinary rates will, over 70 years, accumulate property. It is mathematics. What is genuinely remarkable and what the outside world consistently underestimates is the communal financial infrastructure that makes this accumulation possible. Uh, Hasidic communities have developed sophisticated internal lending systems, Gemachs, interest-free loan funds that allow community members to borrow money for business ventures, for home purchases, for weddings, without the interest payments that drain wealth in the conventional financial system. They have developed business networks of extraordinary density and loyalty. A Hasidic businessman in Williamsburg will preferentially hire from, sell to, and buy from other members of his community, creating an internal economic circulation that keeps wealth within the community to a degree that secular business culture rarely achieves. And they vote. They vote as a bloc in local elections and state elections, with a discipline and a unity that gives their community political leverage far beyond what their numbers alone would suggest. Local politicians in Brooklyn know that the Hasidic community delivers its votes reliably in exchange for specific, concrete benefits, zoning variances, school funding, infrastructure investments. This is not corruption, it is politics. It is exactly what every other organized interest group in American democracy does. The Hasidim are simply better at it than most. Here is the thing that the series Unorthodox got right, and the thing it missed. What it got right is that the internal world of Hasidic communities is, for those born inside it, genuinely all-encompassing. There is no separation between religion and culture, between private and public, between the sacred and the mundane. Every aspect of life, what you eat, how you dress, who you marry, how you conduct business, how you raise your children, what you read, what you watch, who you talk to, is governed by a comprehensive framework of religious law and communal expectation. For people who find meaning and belonging within that framework, it is not experienced as oppression. It is experienced as home, as clarity, as a life that knows exactly what it is for. But to understand how that framework is transmitted, how a community maintains that level of internal coherence generation after generation in the middle of the most information saturated city on earth, you have to look at the Hasidic education system. And what you find there is one of the most remarkable institutions in modern America. Hasidic children do not attend public schools. They attend yeshivas, religious schools that are, in practice, entirely separate from the American public education system. Boys and girls are educated separately from a very young age. Boys spend the majority of their school hours studying religious texts, Torah, Talmud, Hasidic teachings. Secular subjects like mathematics, English, and science are taught in much more limited quantities than state law technically requires, a fact that has generated years of legal battles between the Hasidic community and New York State education authorities. Girls receive somewhat more secular education than boys, partly because in Hasidic communities, it is often the wife who manages the family's financial affairs and interface with the outside world, while the husband devotes himself to religious study. The yeshiva system produces adults who are, by the standards of the secular world, significantly undereducated in secular subjects. Many Hasidic men in their 20s have never read a novel, never studied history beyond Jewish history, have limited mathematical skills beyond basic arithmetic, and speak English as a second language, with Yiddish as their primary tongue. From the outside, this looks like a failure of education. From the inside, it looks like a success because the goal of Hasidic education is not to prepare children for the secular labor market, it is to transmit a way of life. To create adults who know who they are, where they come from, what they believe, and how to live. And by that measure, the yeshiva system works extraordinarily well. The community cohesion it produces, the shared language, the shared reference points, the shared sense of identity is something that secular education, for all its breadth and ambition, struggles to replicate. The flip side of this cohesion is the experience of those who leave. The OTD community, off the derrick, off the path, has grown significantly in the internet age, precisely because young Hasidic people who feel doubts or curiosity about the outside world now have access to information their parents and grandparents never had. A teenager in Williamsburg with a smartphone hidden under the mattress can access everything the secular world has to offer, and some of them, having accessed it, decide they cannot go back. The cost of leaving a Hasidic community is, by any outside measure, devastating. You lose your family not always permanently, but often for years, and sometimes forever. You lose your community, your social network, your support system, your entire framework of meaning. You emerge into the secular world without the educational credentials, the secular social skills, or the cultural fluency that most people take for granted. Organizations like Footsteps in New York exist specifically to help people who have left ultra-Orthodox communities rebuild their lives in the secular world. And the stories they tell are genuinely heartbreaking, not because the people who left made the wrong choice, but because the choice itself costs so much. And yet, most people who leave say, when asked, that they had no choice. That once they had seen what they had seen, once they had asked the questions they could not stop asking, there was no way to go back to the certainty that had surrounded them since birth. This tension between the extraordinary gift of a complete, coherent, meaning-saturated life and the extraordinary cost of the conformity required to sustain it is at the heart of every serious engagement with the Hasidic world, because Hasidic Judaism is not simply strict orthodoxy with unusual clothes. It is a mystical tradition of extraordinary richness, rooted in Kabbalah, animated by the Baal Shem Tov's vision of a God present in every moment of existence, sustained by a tradition of storytelling and spiritual teaching that has produced some of the most beautiful religious literature in the world. The concept of the Rebbe, the living spiritual master through whom divine blessing flows to the community, is not a cultural habit. It is a profound theological claim about the nature of divine presence in the world. The Hasidic belief in the power of joy simcha as a form of worship is not sentimentality. It is a sophisticated theological position about the relationship between human emotion and divine reality. The Hasidic tradition of the Tish the Rebbe's table, where hundreds of followers gather on Friday night to sing and eat and receive the Rebbe's teaching, is not a dinner party. It is a ritual reenactment of the mystical gathering around a source of spiritual light, a practice rooted in Kabbalistic ideas about how divine energy flows through the world. They are not songs. They are technologies of transcendence. They are what the Baal Shem Tov discovered in that Ukrainian forest 300 years ago, that joy is not the opposite of holiness. Joy is holiness. The Hasidic belief in the power of simcha joy as a form of worship is not sentimentality. It is a sophisticated theological position about the relationship between human emotion and divine reality. And in the middle of Brooklyn, in fur hats and long black coats, in a language the world had written off as dead, the Hasidim are still proving it. The melodies sung at the Tish on Friday nights, the Nigunim, the wordless melodies that Hasidic tradition says carry the soul beyond the reach of language into direct encounter with the divine, are among the most emotionally powerful pieces of music the Jewish world has ever produced. A nigun has no words because words are insufficient. A nigun bypasses the intellect and goes straight to the place in a human being that is older than language, older than thought, the place where the divine spark the Baal Shem Tov said was hidden in every human soul actually lives. To hear a room of 500 Hasidic men singing a nigun together, swaying in unison, their voices filling a Brooklyn synagogue on a Friday night while the secular city rushes past outside, is to understand whatever your theology, whatever your relationship to religion, that these people have found something real, something that the modern world, with all its freedom and all its information and all its relentless noise, has not figured out how to replace. The story of the Hasidim in Brooklyn is, in the end, a story about a question that modernity has never satisfactorily answered. Is it possible to be fully human, fully present, fully alive, fully connected to meaning and community and purpose without embracing the modern world's definition of freedom? The modern world says freedom means choice, it means mobility, it means the right to reinvent yourself, to leave your community, to shed your history, to become whoever you decide to be. The Hasidim say something different. They say that freedom is not the absence of constraint, it is the presence of meaning. That a life lived within a structure of profound religious obligation, within a community of people who know you completely and will never abandon you, within a tradition that connects you to every generation that came before you back to Sinai, that this life is not a prison, it is a gift. And they have built in the most aggressively individualistic city on earth a community that embodies that alternative vision with a coherence and a durability that secular culture has found impossible to replicate. You do not have to agree with them. You do not have to share their theology or their politics or their relationship to the outside world. But to dismiss them as ignorant, as backward, as victims of their own tradition is to miss something important. Something about the human need for belonging that the modern world has not yet figured out how to provide. The Hasidim of Brooklyn arrived with nothing, they built everything. In fur hats, in long black coats, in a language the world had written off as dead, and they are still there, still growing, still praying, still buying buildings. And if you walk through Williamsburg on a Friday evening just before sunset, and you watch the men walking to shul in their Sabbath clothes while the rest of the city rushes past them on the way to somewhere else, you might feel for just a moment that they know something the rest of us do not. What that something is, that is the question worth asking. Leave your answer in the comments. And next time, we are going to enter another world that exists in plain sight and almost no one understands. A world where angels have names, where the soul has a map, and where the most mystical tradition in Judaism has been hiding its deepest secrets for 1,000 years. We are going to open the Kabbalah. All of it. Stay curious.